Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 26. Today, we will get started on planning out the next phase of expansion, namely the construction yard on that small peninsula we designated in the last video. And since it will be an episode where we will be doing things we already accomplished in other places, I thought it would be a great place to talk to you about my experience with the recently released Cities Skylines 2, and why it will likely not appear on the channel anytime soon. Whenever I do something that requires no real explanation, since we talked about it before, I will instead try to put my opinion into words about CS2. But before we get to it, we will need to do a bit of housekeeping, since we need to sort out a couple small things closer to home, so distribution works a bit better. Before we get started, if this is not your first video from this channel, you already know what to expect. If you want to be kept up to date, please consider subscribing, and if you like what you see, leaving a like will also help letting me know what to focus on. But enough talking, let's get into it. First, let's make sure that we use recycled materials before we resort to importing anything else. Now that we use trains to do that import jobs, we can repurpose our old road-based distribution office to only deal with the recycled stuff. That office will try to keep the different storages at 90%, and if it cannot use those places to dump the extra stuff, then it will take those extra materials to the border for exports instead. The last thing we need is to have our garbage processing get clogged up, so we are better off selling things we can't handle, instead of having garbage pile up in town. After that office is set up, then we just need to tell the railroad distribution to only fill up the storages to 70%, so there is a bit of wiggle room left for the recycled materials. Because the trains move a lot more stuff than the trucks, they will likely end up overfilling the storages, but that won't matter. In those cases the excess will just get sold off. We are not yet in the part where I talk about CS2, but I thought I should tell you that I do not have the game on Steam. Paradox Interactive did not consider my channel to be worth a key, so I ended up subscribing to the Microsoft Game Pass service, where the game was included. I am quite glad I could try out the game this way. If I had to pay full price for it, I feel I might be even more negative about it, because I don't feel it's worth the price they are asking for it. Anyways, let's get back to the matters at hand, and I will talk about my opinions in detail a bit later. Next up on the housekeeping chores, the workers going to Satsumagrad, instead of the refinery. For now, I just told the internal buses in Dolny to get back to dropping workers off at the old bus station, and not to bother with going to the train station. The refinery is overstaffed already, it doesn't need more workers. I even included a small waypoint to make sure the route the buses take better reflect the official line. They don't seem to turn around at the tram stop, so adding the waypoint will hopefully make sure the line spacing is more accurate. Well, this is where we will start working on the new area. It will commence with a long bit of terraforming, which will require a local set of bulldozers and excavators. For those, I just used a pair of free construction offices, an extra gas station for refueling, and once they are in place, I will get to work. Which means, from here on out I will do a lot of things that we've done a million times before, so how about I try to express how I feel about Cities Skylines 2? Just like all good reviews, let's start with the good. Despite the many issues surrounding the game, there are a lot to like about it. Sadly, they are not enough to really counterbalance all that is wrong with the game, but there are undisputed improvements to the genre in there. Let's start with the quality of life improvements. One of my favorites is the new road building system. It is not perfect, and I'm sure modders will make it better, but it is a great foundation for creating nice looking road networks. I especially like the way the game handles every lane as a potential snapping point for branching off from the main road. In CS1, we had to resort to using several different mods to accomplish this, like Move It, Node Controller, Traffic Manager, etc. Now it's just a matter of lining things up, and things just fall into place. Building nice looking highway intersections is now easier than ever, and once modders get their hands on the tools they need to create in-depth modifications for the game, I am sure they will improve it even more. Obviously the new system is nowhere near as in-depth as we are used to in the previous game after some extensive modding, but it is light years better than what we had in vanilla CS1. So things are really promising on that part. The next thing I really liked is the potential for a complex economy in the game. Before I say what's good about it, I feel I need to make sure I also say that at the time of this video's creation, this system was bugged, and the developers did acknowledge this. So please bear that in mind. In this section I am talking more about the potential of the system, not really the current state of it, which is a shambles. Anyways, the economic model used in the game resembles the industry DLC we had in CS1, but done through the default zone factories. Apart from a couple landmark buildings we get for accomplishing certain goals and milestones, there are no real ways of building factories in the game individually, only by zoning, setting lower taxes for certain industrial sectors, and hoping they would show up as zones get filled up. But, each factory that do get built in those zones all have their individual material inputs they require, and they can procure these materials from either importing them from other cities, or by finding them locally. And once they have the materials, they will produce stuff, which they can either sell to local businesses, or export them. In CS1, we could set up these production chains ourselves with the industry's DLC, but in CS2, it's all done through zoning, and through some tax incentives to encourage certain types of industries to settle in town. It has great potential to be a complex and engaging economic system, but unfortunately, it is not really working as one would expect. As I've said, the developers did acknowledge the issues surrounding it at the moment, and I cannot really comment on how successful they will be in fixing it. But I do like the potential it holds for a great system. The next thing I like about the game is the new modular building system for certain buildings we can place. In the old game, if you needed to expand the capacity of education in your city, you either built a new school somewhere, or downloaded a bigger one from the workshop, and used that instead. Now, we have the option to add small additions to our facilities, so their different functions get expanded. We can add an extra pump to the water extractor, so we can keep using it a bit longer without having to sacrifice more space along the shores. We can add a new wing to the clinic, so it can handle more patients, or build an extra ambulance garage, so we can have more of them out at any given time. And while we are not yet in the part of the review where we start talking about the broken things in the game, I do feel I need to mention that this modular system is far from perfect. Once an attachment is placed, it cannot be moved, or even removed. It's stuck there forever, and if you accidentally misclicked, and you want to have a certain thing in another position, the only way to do that is to demolish the entire building, and start from scratch. It's not really an issue for smaller services, like a taxi depot or firehouse. But for something that costs millions of dollars to build, like a big university, or a massive power station, a simple wrong click can result in some serious regrets. Anyways, back to the good things. The next in the list of positives is the new progression unlocks. In CS1, the game would just give you predetermined buildings as you progress through the milestones, but now you get points you can spend on buildings, like bigger versions of existing services, or more efficient power plants for example. We no longer need to wait an agonizingly long time to unlock the more efficient crematorium to handle the dead, we can unlock it with the very first milestone, and not waste space on a graveyard. Well, maybe one for the aesthetics. I feel that this new system is a much better way of handling the progression, and it allows the player to unlock things they need as the situation requires. There is no point having a college until the need arises, so you can keep unlocked points in reserve, and only spend them when you have to. I really dig the system, even if it is a bit sparse on options at the moment. I can only hope it gets expanded with new stuff over time. There are many more small improvements I could talk about, like the fact that we now have built-in measuring tools for roads in the vanilla game, and things like protractors and rulers are not only available in mods. This makes the construction of precisely laid out roads a breeze. And I also appreciate how the game has a proper built-in photo mode, and I do like these kinds of features. Sometimes I spend more time on taking pictures than playing the game in certain titles, so the inclusion of such features is greatly appreciated. It's a bit of a shame that these pictures are hidden away in the app data folder, instead of being dumped in a more convenient location. And lastly, having the pipes and cables all tucked away under roads is a huge improvement. It always felt a bit clunky that we had to drag big power pylons between isolated neighborhoods in CS1, and the ability to move them underground is definitely a highlight for me. These are the positives that came to mind. There are many issues that I cannot overlook however, and unfortunately, they are outweighing the positives at the moment. Let's start with the most glaringly obvious issue, the performance. It is no secret that the game is very badly optimized, and the graphics options have to be scaled back considerably, even on quite beefy PCs, just to achieve a relatively smooth experience, while still only having the game run on 1080p. My system is slightly above average, with an Intel i5-11400, the 16GB version of the RTX 4060 as the GPU, and 16 gigs of RAM. And even I had to turn almost everything down to the minimum setting, just to keep the game dipping below 30 FPS when the city gets to a population of about 15 to 20,000. And given how sensitive the game is about the resolution, I am frankly amazed that the only upscaling option we have is the first generation FSR. If we had more up-to-date versions, like DLSS 2, or maybe even 3, then some of these performance issues could have been avoided. Not to mention that people are starting to uncover possible culprits for these issues. One of which is that pedestrians have highly detailed teeth, and they are all fully rendered with zero level of detail applied to them, so if there are a lot of people on the screen, performance gets a huge hit. It is quite perplexing why they even included these kinds of details for a game that is played from a bird's eye view, let alone not think of adding the option to scale down the detail on these things if viewed from far away. Not gonna lie. The whole thing feels like it was all rushed through the door to meet some kind of financial benchmark for shareholders, regardless of how finished the game was. And as we dive deeper into more of the issues, the more apparent it will become that this is very likely what happened. So, if you are planning on playing with a below average system, or maybe even something that could be considered a middle of the road gaming setup, I would say wait a couple months, and then maybe invest in a month of the Game Pass subscription to try out the game. It is really not ready for prime time. And as I've said earlier, unfortunately performance is just one of the many issues plaguing the game, most of which are all about things that feel like they were left unfinished to meet the unreasonable deadline set by management. So, if you want to blame someone for the state of the game, blame the higher-ups. As always, the passionate artists and engineers working on the game proper are not to blame. Their bosses are. The next huge sticking point for me is building variety. If you happen to have the game, and haven't noticed this yet, I strongly suggest you place individual zones with completely uniform dimensions. You will notice that the resulting buildings will all look exactly the same. The only variation will be the color, and the props used to decorate their surroundings, but the building model itself will be the same. Every single 6x6 residential skyscraper will look the exact same. Same goes for low-density suburban homes. If you zoom in on a single area, you will notice that every single 2-tile wide plot will have the same exact house model. When I discovered this, I was incredibly disheartened. I can only hope that this is the result of the rushed development, and not a cynical ploy by management to force building variety DLC down our throats. The next big sticking point for me was the bugged economy I mentioned earlier. While the system has great potential, it is absolutely not functioning as one would expect, and the fact that it managed to get through quality assurance is just another point going toward my idea of the game being pushed out prematurely for corporate reasons. The first warning sign for me was the incredibly sparse traffic around the factories in town. I purposefully had a centralized industrial district just to see what kind of traffic issues I would end up facing, and I ended up with a ghost town. I had maybe a dozen or so delivery trucks drive around the place. In CS1, even a small-sized industrial park would end up generating a massive amount of truck traffic, but here, we have nothing of the sort. Just a couple of them milling around, not really doing much. The next issue I encountered regarding the economy was when I built a cargo harbor, and a bit later, a cargo train station. I set them a route to move stuff between our city and our neighbors through border connections, but they only ever imported things, never exported anything. Both the ships and the trains went out empty, brought in a bunch of stuff which were dropped off at their respective stops, and then went out empty to bring in more stuff. And once the station and the docks were filled up to about halfway, they didn't even import anything either. They just ran back and forth empty. But, once again I need to say that the developers said that they are aware of this, and they claimed it was a bug. I guess time will tell. And speaking of traffic, this is another thing that is a bit of a letdown for me. We have all these amazing new road building tools to play with, and yet, in a city with a population of 20,000, the amount of vehicles on the roads are incredibly sparse. I didn't ever feel the need to build up a bus network, let alone the need to build a subway. The closest comparison I could come up with was that the traffic felt like the game was set during the quarantine from a couple years ago, and everyone was working from home, or were on furlough. The only time I ever encountered any form of a traffic problem was when I did a big zoning project at once, and I had a rush of cars coming in with the new tenants all together, clogging up the only bridge leading into town. But, as soon as that rush died down, it was all back the usual trickle of cars and trucks going by once in a blue moon. Some would consider the amount of traffic in CS1 to be over the top, But it seems they went way too far the other way, and now even sizable towns look like they are in the middle of lockdown. Just to simulate a bit of traffic in my city, I ended up building 8 separate taxi depots, all with extra garages to house 35 taxis each. With all 280 of them running around the place, things started to feel a tiny bit more lively. The next big sticking point is the handling of some of the services in town. Let's start with the lesser of the problems, namely the way fires are being dealt with. In CS1, once the fire trucks arrived on the scene, we would get a small animation of firefighters spraying their hoses. Simple, yet effective. Unfortunately, in CS2 the trucks just park themselves in front of the building that is on fire, wait around until it's extinguished, and either drive home, or go park themselves near the next closest fire. There is no animation of firefighters spraying the fire. The fire engine just stops in front of the building, waits, and leaves. Another sign that the developers didn't have the time they needed to finish the game properly. But that's just a cosmetic issue. What I am more disappointed by is the garbage collection service. It is entirely broken. Let me explain. In other games, if garbage isn't collected, you would get a bunch of very angry people, and they would eventually leave altogether. Here, nothing happens. You can completely ignore the entire thing, which is what I usually ended up doing. You don't need a landfill, or a recycling center, or an incinerator. If you don't build any of these, nothing will happen. No garbage will build up in the city, nobody will complain, and before you ask, no, it isn't even being picked up through the border connections by other cities. It is literally a ghost feature. Sure, you can build the buildings that's supposed to handle it, and they will go out, pick it up, and start processing it like they should, but they are nothing but huge wastes of money. I am 100% sure it's not supposed to be like this, and once again, another sign that the game is nowhere near finished. The other services seem to be working as intended at least. People do complain if there is too much crime, and police cars do end up reducing the likelihood of it happening as they patrol the city, and same goes for healthcare, death care, schooling, and all the other things like this. But the waste handling system is entirely useless, and building the necessary buildings is nothing but wastes of money right now. Even the new parking system seemed to be unfinished. I suppose it's related to the economic and the traffic issues I talked about earlier. Basically, it appears to be entirely unnecessary to build parking lots. Once I discovered that the traffic isn't what it's supposed to be, I did a test city, where I ended up building a road network with nothing but alleyways. For those not in the know, most roads in the game have roadside parking built in, so even if there are no parking lots available, people can just leave their car on the side of the street, and walk to their destination. Except for alleyways. These are narrow, two-way roads, with no room for parking on the sides. And the city still grew more or less fine. And the thing is, what little trouble I ran into didn't really make much sense. Like commercial zones. They kept complaining about the lack of customers, which would have been understandable. Except, they all had built-in parking lots, and those were mostly empty. And the suburban homes have garages, there are barely any sitting on the side of the street even with normal roads. So it made no sense why people couldn't drive from their home to the commercial plot's own parking lot. I did encounter a bit of employment trouble in the industrial sector however, which was more understandable, but still, it all felt rather hit and miss. And the last big sticking point is more of a personal preference, and that is the grid system used by the game. I already felt it was outdated and clunky in the original Cities Skylines, and when I saw that they are still using it in the sequel, I was quite disappointed. Ever since I saw the first video of the game called Townscaper, I felt that the grid system used in that game should be the industry standard. The one used in CS2 is still as clunky as it was in CS1, and even the tiniest amount of deviation from a perfect grid will result in gaps in the grid, which will result in a rather ugly looking zoning as a result, with empty spaces between plots. Now, imagine if it had the system from Townscaper. We could have perfectly filled in residential plots along curvy roads. We could have wedge-shaped buildings where two roads meet at a narrow angle, like the famous Flatiron Building in Manhattan, New York. And even fans of the perfectly even grid systems would be happy, since there is no reason to generate wonky-looking grids, if the roads themselves are at a perfect right angle with each other. But again, this is just a personal preference, and I wouldn't really count it among the many problems the game has. I just wanted to vent my frustration which has been bubbling away at me, ever since the first gameplay videos emerged showing the grid system in use. Same as with the good parts, there are also a few small nuisances here too. Like some kind of level of detail related graphics glitches, where things suddenly turn black as the textures reload, or fences popping in and out even when the camera is standing still, and small inconsistencies with the road building system. This last one can be quite annoying, because in some instances it is very hard to replace only certain sections of roads. You can use the replace tool to upgrade a section of road, but if you have a continuous stretch of it, and you only need to replace half of that, for example to build an asymmetrical road for extra turning lanes at a busy intersection, then trying to build over the existing road can either work, or it can't. It's a flip of the coin. The only way to really solve that situation is to build a side road to break the longer segment into two separate pieces, and upgrade the one you want from there. If you happen to have buildings next to that road that you want to keep, then tough luck. Then there's the problem with modular buildings I talked about earlier. If you place modules next to something, and you change your mind, or if you accidentally misclick, then the only way to change things around is to completely demolish the building, and start over from scratch. For cheaper buildings, this is not really an issue, just a minor annoyance, but for truly massive and expensive buildings, like a university, or bigger power plants, these kinds of mistakes can either cost you a massive fortune, or you just have to live with your mistakes. Sure, you can move the entire power plant to the other side of the city with the click of a button, but moving the individual parts is impossible. As for the overall stability of the game, the broken and unfinished features notwithstanding, I can count myself among the luckier ones. Over the last couple of days, I only had a single crash, while I kept hearing from streamers, and on the forums, that some people experienced frequent crashes. If you are still considering giving the game a try, I suggest looking into this too. And speaking of crashes, I don't know if it's just me, but I did have the autosave function turned off by default. I don't really know who thought this was a good idea, but the first thing everyone should do is turn the feature on. Nothing's more aggravating than losing hours of progress because of an unfortunate glitch. In the end, would I recommend the game? Definitely not. There is a huge amount of potential in it for sure, and once modders get their hands on the tools they need, then it would get even better. But until then, let the developers work on it more, and let the modders get the hang of the ins and outs of the system so they can improve them. Thanks to the Game Pass subscription, you can even give it a try for a little bit every once in a while, and see how things are, but I definitely don't recommend paying full price for it right now. And I think that should pretty much be the end of my mini review of Cities Skylines 2. It was obviously rushed out too early, and it needs way more development time to reach the point where it can worth the asking price. Until then, wait, and just play workers and resources instead. And with that done and dusted, let's get back to the matter at hand in the game we are watching play out right now. If you paid attention, then you know we are done with some of the terraforming around the place of our new town, and we are busy building the next construction yard at the moment. As far as I could tell, we should have everything we need, all the storages and production facilities are going to be present, and all the relevant materials can be brought in by train. Right now, we are busy placing the roads down, and once that's done, we will get started on the actual construction. The unfortunate thing is that it is out of range of our current construction apparatus, so it will need constant supervision to make sure things are actively being constructed, and not left idle because of the distances involved. That should be pretty much all we need in terms of roads. I did forget to include a passenger station of some sort, so that will have to be rectified sometime in the future, but other than that, we should have a functional construction hub. Oh, and let's not forget about the power. We also need some of that stuff. Here, I discovered that after setting up the road distribution to deal with the recyclables only, I forgot to deal with the rail construction office. It is now out of prefab panels. Tinkering a bit with the relevant office however, and deliveries should resume. I did try to see if maybe we could use some other form of delivery for these materials, but ultimately, that office is what we will go with. I even tried to see if maybe we can deliver stuff by train, but that was a no-go. The only thing I changed from the first attempt was that I instead opted to use the customs house to buy them. I still wanted the office to prioritize the recycled materials, and if we use the open storage, then it would just use that for the other three, since that's what is closest to the office. Also, in the meantime we got started on the last big research project, the nuclear production chain. We are just getting started on the yellowcake production, so we still have some way to go. Now, I also wanted to use that small island behind the hub for the town distribution center, so we can store the consumer goods close to home. Letting trains drive through the hub seemed like a good idea, so I added a separate track that drove around it all, and bridge over the water to get to the island. Right now, this place is a complete terminus for the rail network, so to make sure there is a way to keep it going deeper into the mainland, we need to make sure this is not the end of the line. I don't really know where the branching off point will be, so for now we just build a T-junction, and maybe make adjustments later. Great, the track layers are out of the depot once more. It seems the prefab panels have arrived. To reach the city center, we will need to go over the small island in the middle, so we will need at least 2 bridges for this to work. Obviously, there will be many more bridges before this is all over, but it's a start. Now we just need a cargo station to drop off the goods, a place to store them away, and I think we will stop there for the time being. Before we say goodbye, let's upgrade the roads. I think it's time for a change of scenery. Instead of using asphalt roads exclusively, this time we will use prefab panels instead. I used asphalt in the previous place for the speed, but ultimately, it's not really all that important in the hub itself, so I will yield to the popular opinion, and use prefabs instead. Now we just place a pair of big construction offices, and I think we can call it a day. In the next episode, I think we will continue working on the area a lot more. With the construction hub more or less ready to be built, we will turn our attention to the city itself. I would love it to be a relatively small mining and steel working community, so I don't think we will go as wild as we did with Dolny. 2, maybe 3,000 people should be our aim, and maybe a couple hundred more for the town services. Oh wait. We also need garbage processing. I guess we will just need to wait and see where we go from here. The biggest obstacle is that huge hill on the island, which can be a problem, as the slopes will cut down on the overall useful land we can build on. I like the idea of having a city with 2 different levels, but I would hate wasting so much space. Anyways, if you haven't done it already, I'd love it if you subscribe to the channel, and leaving a like would also let me know that this video was worth making. If you feel that it was good enough, and you can afford it, please consider going to my Ko-fi page, which you can find in the description, and donate an amount that you feel is appropriate. And if you did like what you've seen, there should be links to some of my other videos and playlists on the screen. Thank you for your support, and I'll see you in the next one.